Across Europe, long before modern cranes or precision tools existed, entire skylines slowly rose one stone at a time. Travelers who approached medieval towns often saw just one thing rising above rooftops: a tall, silent tower built by hands that worked patiently through cold mornings, long seasons, and years that blended together. These towers were landmarks, signals, meeting points. But behind each one stood builders whose skill shaped the world far more than their names ever did. Tonight, we're going to step into their world, not in moments of triumph, but in the quiet routines that made those towering structures possible. We'll explore how builders organized their days, how they worked with simple tools to lift impossibly heavy materials, how they timed their tasks with sunlight, and how communities depended on their steady progress. It's a peaceful, slow journey into a craft that reached toward the sky while remaining firmly grounded in patience. Before we begin, if these calm historical stories help you relax or drift toward sleep, make sure to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And tell me in the comments, if you lived back then, would you rather shape the stones, lift them, or plan the tower from the ground? Your answers always inspire new episodes. Now settle in, breathe slowly, and let's climb, gently, into the world of the builders who raised Europe's tallest towers. Long before the first stone of a tall tower ever touched the ground, the builders' day began in silence. They arrived when the streets were still empty and the town was wrapped in the gentle dimness of early morning. There were no crowds watching, no spectators imagining the size the structure would one day reach. Instead, there was only a quiet field, an open square, or a patch of earth that had been chosen carefully, not because it looked impressive, but because it could bear weight. And in these earliest hours, the builders began preparing for something far larger than anyone passing by could fully imagine. Their mornings did not begin with height. They began with ground. Builders knew that every tall tower, no matter how grand it would grow, depended entirely on the stability of what lay beneath it. So as the rest of the town slowly stirred awake, the builders gathered around the marked area, looking not upward but downward, studying soil, measuring distances, and deciding where each future stone would rest. Most people in the town never saw this part of tower construction. They saw the rising silhouette months or years later. But the true foundation of every great tower was set in these quiet, unobserved hours. Builders gathered their tools, stretched their backs after carrying heavy loads, and spoke in low voices about the day's tasks. Their conversations were practical, patient, and unhurried. A tall tower was never rushed. It grew only as fast as hands, tools, and materials allowed to dawn. The ground was cool and firm, making it the perfect time to work. Builders walked slowly around the site, inspecting markers placed the day before. These markers, simple wooden stakes with ropes stretched between them, outlined the exact shape the tower's base would take. Even a slight change in the angle could alter the stability of the entire structure. Builders stepped carefully, studying the distance between stakes, adjusting ropes, tightening them, and checking them again. This process repeated so often that by the time sunlight touched the ropes, they had been inspected dozens of times. Next came the clearing of the ground. Builders removed stones, roots, and any soft soil that might shift under the future weight. They used wooden shovels with iron edges, grips worn smooth by years of use. Each scoop of soil needed to be placed neatly aside because the builders reused much of this earth later when leveling the area around the base. Nothing in their routine was wasted. Nothing was done quickly. Their work followed the natural rhythm of early morning, a quiet pace that matched the slow brightening of the sky. The builders also checked their tools: wooden mallets, chisels, plumb lines, and measuring rods. The plumb line, a simple weight attached to a string, was one of their most important tools. It allowed them to ensure that future stones would stand perfectly straight. Builders trusted this simple tool more than anything with gears or mechanisms. It never lied, never faltered, and never broke when treated with care. In their hands, it became a quiet guardian of precision as the sun lifted higher. Shadows stretched across the site, giving the builders a clearer sense of depth and distance. They observed how the morning light fell on the earth. Light guided many decisions, where certain foundation stones would fit best, which surfaces needed leveling, and how deep to dig before reaching solid ground. Builders developed a relationship with the morning light, relying on its steady growth through the hours to reveal imperfections that dim dawn could not show. Once the ground was fully cleared and leveled, the builders began preparing the foundation trench. This trench would support the immense weight of stone that generations would one day admire. Digging it required strength, but more importantly, foresight. Builders needed to know which layers of soil were firm enough, which were too loose, which needed reinforcing. They dug slowly and deliberately, pausing often to test the firmness of each layer by pressing it underfoot, gripping it in their hands, and assessing how it held its shape. During this stage, the builders spoke to one another in short, calm phrases. They asked for another tool, pointed to a softer patch of soil, or suggested shifting the trench slightly. Their conversations lacked urgency because tower construction was never a race. It unfolded gradually, always shaped by the builders' patience. These discussions also reflected their respect for one another. No single builder led every decision. Experience was shared, not hoarded. If one noticed something in the soil, everyone listened. If another advised a depth adjustment, the team followed without hesitation. This collective decision-making became the backbone of every successful tower. As the trench deepened, builders reinforced its sides with wooden beams to prevent collapse. They placed these beams with precision, testing each one for stability. Some beams came from forests outside the town, chosen specifically for their straightness and strength. Builders handled them with care, mindful that these pieces of wood would shape the earliest stages of a structure intended to last for centuries. By mid-morning, sunlight warmed the site enough to dry the surface of the earth. This allowed builders to begin compacting the remaining soil, pressing it firmly into place using long, flat wooden tampers. The rhythm of tamping was steady and soothing. Builders lifted the tampers, brought them down in repeated, controlled motions, and created a uniform surface that would support the first stones. The sound of tamping echoed softly across the area, marking the moment when preparation shifted into solid shaping. Only after the ground was fully prepared did the builders bring over the first foundation stones. These stones were not lifted high. They were not placed dramatically. Instead, they were carried slowly, often by teams of men using wooden frames or small wheels fashioned to roll over uneven ground. These stones were heavy, but they represented only the beginning, the part of the tower that would remain hidden beneath all that followed. Builders did not begin stacking stones immediately. They first arranged the largest blocks around the trench, aligning them with the ropes and markers. Each stone was examined for flatness, thickness, and edges strong enough to support vertical weight. If a stone needed trimming, builders used chisels to shape it carefully, removing small pieces at a time rather than striking it forcefully. The goal was not speed but precision, and their hands practiced this precision until it became instinctive. Before setting the first stone into place, builders tested the trench again. They pressed their weight along its edges, checked the angles with plumb lines, and measured distances repeatedly. Their patience in these moments ensured that nothing would shift or settle unevenly years later. A good foundation stone placed well could last centuries without movement. A poorly placed one could compromise the entire tower. Builders understood this deeply, and they allowed no room for error. As the day progressed, the builders finally lowered the first stones into the trench. They set them gently, tilting, adjusting, and aligning until each one fit perfectly against the next. These stones did not yet rise into the sky. They remained low, close to the earth, unseen by most town residents. But they mattered more than all the stones that would follow. These foundation blocks held the weight of every future stone, every future year, every future footstep on the tower's floors. When the foundation stones were aligned, builders mixed mortar. Early mortar was a quiet combination of water, sand, and lime. Simple materials transformed into something strong through patience. Builders stirred it slowly, feeling the texture with their hands, ensuring it bound stones without slipping between them. They applied the mortar with wooden paddles and brushes, smoothing it in gentle motions that created a seal between one stone and the next. Throughout all this, the builders kept their pace steady. Into midday, the work continued with calm focus. The first stones settled into place, supported by compacted earth and reinforced trenches. The builders stepped back frequently, checking alignment, adjusting slightly, and then checking again. Their method was patient and deliberate, a reflection of their understanding that tall towers could only rise with strong beginnings. Be why the time shadows shortened and midday arrived. The base of the tower was still low. No one passing by would have guessed that these stones would someday form the foundation of a structure visible from distant hills. But the builders knew. They understood that everything magnificent began quietly, with soil, steady hands, and stones carefully placed at dawn. Their day would continue long after midday. But the first stage, the most important one, always belonged to morning. It was the time when the town was still quiet, when builders could listen to the subtle sounds of tools, earth, and stone. It was when they laid not only the physical foundation of the tower, but the slow, patient rhythm that would guide every stage of its construction. And so, before a single stone rose high enough to cast a shadow, the builders shaped the unseen heart of the tower, the part that would bear everything above it, enduring long after the builders themselves had passed, and remaining silent proof of their calm, steady work. Before a tower ever began to show its height above the rooftops, the builders devoted weeks, sometimes months, to preparing the materials that would form its body. Though many people imagine tower building as a dramatic process of lifting stone after stone toward the sky, the builders' daily experience was far quieter, more methodical, and rooted in a deep respect for the materials themselves. To them, every stone, every beam, and every tool had a purpose. Nothing was rushed, and nothing was taken for granted. The builders arrived early each morning not only to break ground or place stones, but to inspect tools with a carefulness that bordered on ritual. These tools were simple in appearance, yet essential to the entire project. Hammers, chisels, wooden mallets, measuring rods, straight edges, levels, plumb lines, saws, and carts. Each one carried years of wear and the marks of countless hands. Many of the builders had used the same tools on other structures, town walls, houses, bridges. They maintained them with quiet diligence, sharpening edges, tightening joints, and replacing worn cords on plumb lines. Tools were never left scattered. Builders placed them in designated spots near the worksite, arranged according to the sequence of tasks for the day. The quiet clack of chisels being checked, the brushing of wood shavings from tool handles, and the gentle weight of mallets in hands all signaled the beginning of a builder's morning. These sounds were not loud, but they were steady, an early rhythm that prepared both tools and minds for long hours of work. Just as important as tools were the materials, stone and timber. These were the elements that would shape the identity and lifespan of the tower. Builders worked closely with quarrymen who carved blocks from nearby stone quarries. The journey of each stone did not begin at the tower site, but in these quarries, where workers cut large blocks using wooden wedges soaked in water, chisels, and simple leverage. Some of the blocks were massive, far heavier than what most people could imagine being moved without machinery. But in the builder's world, the process was normal, demanding, yes, but manageable through teamwork and patience. When stones arrived at the tower site, they were placed in a staging area and organized. Open space where builders measured, marked, and tested each block. Builders examined every face of a stone, noting its natural grain, its weight distribution, and any irregularities that might affect how it would fit with others. They arranged stones in rows according to their purpose. Some would be base stones, others cornerstones, some interior fill stones, and some decorative pieces for later stages of the tower. Cornerstones, in particular, required careful shaping. Builders used chisels to refine edges, tapping gently with wooden mallets to avoid cracking the stone. Each tap echoed lightly across the site, blending with the shifting sounds of the morning. These taps framed the early work hours, creating a calm, steady beat that matched the builder's movements. Timber preparation also played a major role. Although towers were largely stone structures, wood was essential for scaffolding, platforms, walkways, and support frames. Builders needed long, straight beams that could span multiple levels as the tower grew. Carpenters worked alongside stone builders, shaping beams with axes and saws. Their motions were controlled and measured, producing neat curls of wood that fell onto the ground in soft piles. Scaffolding was one of the most important timber constructions at the site. Without it, Builders had no safe way to reach higher levels. But scaffolding was not erected all at once. It grew slowly with the tower. Carpenter builders built its first sections at ground level, ensuring that the beams were strong and stable. They reinforced joints with wooden pegs, ropes, and braces that allowed the structure to remain firm even as weight shifted on it. The builders tested these supports by walking across them, feeling for any soft movement or sway. Only when they were satisfied would work continue upward. These preparations occupied long stretches of time before any visible progress took shape. In fact, townspeople often grew impatient, wondering why the tower seemed to take so long to rise. They saw the builders busy every morning but noticed no change in the skyline. But the builders were not discouraged. They understood that the invisible work, the shaping, checking, aligning, and preparing, determined the strength of the tower far more than the visible stones stacked above ground. One of the key elements in early-stage construction was lime. Builders created lime mortar by heating limestone in kilns until it crumbled into powder, then mixing it with sand and water. The mixture produced a smooth, thick paste that bonded stones together. Builders stirred this mortar in large tubs, using long wooden paddles. The consistency needed to be just right, not too dry, not too watery. Builders tested it by spreading a small amount on the edge of a stone. If it held its shape and clung without sliding, it was ready. The mortar preparation was a quiet art, requiring patience as much as skill. Builders took turns stirring, scraping the sides of tubs, and adding small amounts of water or sand as needed. As the morning wore on, the tubs emitted a mild, earthy scent, a sign that the mixture was blending properly. This scent became part of the environment of the tower site, a natural element of the builder's world. Meanwhile, other builders used ropes and pulleys to test lifting mechanisms. These mechanisms, simple wooden frames with turning wheels, would later lift stones to higher levels. Builders inspected ropes for fraying, replaced worn fibers, and rubbed new ropes with natural oils to keep them smooth and durable. The pulleys creaked quietly as they were tested, their wooden wheels spinning gently in the morning light. These lifting mechanisms did not replace human labor. Rather, they assisted it. Builders still carried stones using long wooden stretchers, with multiple men supporting each side. They walked in unison, coordinating each step to keep the stone level. Such teamwork required experience, communication, and trust. The builders' coordinated breathing and footsteps became part of the tower's early rhythm. As the hours progressed, the site gradually shifted from preparation to placement. Builders marked where each stone would eventually go. They drew lines on the ground with chalk, charcoal, or sticks dipped in water. These lines served as guides throughout construction. Workers followed them carefully, ensuring the tower rose perfectly aligned. Even the slightest deviation could cause problems later, but the builders were patient. They walked slowly along the markings, double-checking each line, adjusting ropes as needed. Their work resembled a quiet dance, careful steps, steady hands, and repeated movements honed through years of experience. One often overlooked part of their preparation was soil management. As stones and timber accumulated on the site, the ground compacted under their weight. Builders raked and leveled the ground frequently, ensuring that wagons and workers could move smoothly. They filled small depressions with gravel, creating stable walking paths. This task was simple but essential. A safe path helped prevent accidents and kept the work flowing peacefully. The builders also prepared water supplies, stored in barrels and clay vessels. They used this water for mixing mortar, smoothing stones, cleaning tools, and cooling hands warmed by hours of shaping and lifting. Water was treated carefully. It was not wasted. Every drop had a use. Through all these preparations, the builders moved with a calm rhythm. They did not rush, even when tasked with completing a large project. The builders understood the nature of time differently from others. They knew a tower was not measured in days or even months. It was measured in steady, repeated motions carried out over countless mornings. Time did not rush them. It guided them. By midday, the builders had often completed a surprising amount of work, though little of it rose visibly above the ground. They stood back occasionally to assess their progress, wiping dust from their hands or adjusting tools. Their conversations remained low and steady, filled with short remarks about materials, measurements, and the next steps. An outsider The site might have looked like a collection of stones, wood, and tools arranged in no particular order. But to the builders, every item was exactly where it needed to be. The site was an organized workspace shaped by experience. Each builder knew where to find what he needed without hesitation. This organization allowed the tower to rise later with remarkable smoothness, i.e. the slow accumulation of prepared materials. The builders created the real foundation of the tower, not merely the ground, but the readiness of every component. Stones shaped to perfection, timbers smoothed and fitted, mortar mixed to the right consistency, tools sharpened, ropes checked, scaffolding tested. These tasks formed the heart of their early work. Only when all materials were fully prepared did the builders begin the next stage, raising the first layers of stone above the ground. But that part would come later. For now, the focus remained on preparation, quiet, deliberate, and essential, and so, each morning passed in a slow, careful dance of shaping, measuring, smoothing, and lifting. These were the hidden hours when the true structure of the tower took form, not in height, but in readiness. The builders knew that the calm attention they gave to each material determined whether the tower would stand strong for decades, centuries, or even longer. When the builders finally moved past the stage of preparations, when the tools were sharpened, the timber was stacked, the mortar was mixed, and the foundation stones settled firmly into their trenches, something subtle but important changed at the worksite. The ground, which for weeks had remained flat and filled with measured markers, now became a place of vertical possibility. For the first time, stones would rise above the soil, creating outlines of walls that, though low, marked the beginning of a tower that would one day stand over the town like a quiet sentinel. This transition from horizontal to vertical work was one of the most carefully managed phases of tower construction. Builders understood that the strength of a tall tower depended not only on a good foundation, but on the precision of the first few layers above it. These early layers determined the alignment, weight distribution, and the long-term stability of everything that followed. Each stone placed at this stage had to fit flawlessly, not almost, not nearly, but exactly. The builders began the morning by reviewing the alignment of the foundation stones. They walked the perimeter, studying the way each block rested, checking the mortar that held them, and tracing lines with their fingers to detect the slightest unevenness. If a stone had shifted even slightly during the drying of the mortar, adjustments had to be made before the next layer could begin. Builders used plumb lines to check vertical alignment and long wooden straight edges to ensure horizontal levelness. These tools were simple but precise, guiding every decision. The first stones of the rising wall were often some of the largest. Builders chose strong, broad blocks that could anchor the weight above them. These stones formed what was known as the first course. Before placing them, builders spread a thin, even layer of fresh mortar across the top of the foundation stones. Mortar served not only to bind stones together, but also to create a uniform surface that reduced tiny imperfections in the stone's shape. Carrying these stones required coordinated teamwork. Builders used wooden stretchers, thick planks with handles at both ends, to transport stones from the staging area to the exact placement spot. 4 or 6 men would lift the stretcher, stepping in practiced unison. Their footfalls were soft and measured. They communicated with quiet phrases, adjusting their pace or direction with subtle cues. When they reached the placement area, they set the stretcher down gently, lowering the stone onto the mortar with care. Once the stone touched the mortar, the builders did not push or force it. Instead, they tapped it gently with wooden mallets, nudging it slightly until it rested in its perfect position. They checked alignment repeatedly with plumb lines and straight edges, making small corrections until all measurements matched their carefully drawn plans. Each stone had to be perfectly squared with its neighbors. No gap was allowed wider than a fingertip's width. No tilt was ignored. No uneven mortar left in place. Although these early layers rose slowly, sometimes only a few inches by midday, the builders felt no impatience. They knew that once the lower walls were stable and aligned, the upper sections could rise more quickly. Their calm, unhurried pace was a discipline shaped by years of experience. They trusted the process, and the process responded with strength. As the first course of stones took shape, the builders added mortar to the gaps between stones, smoothing it with wooden paddles. They brushed excess mortar away carefully, creating clean joints that would reinforce the tower's structural integrity. This smoothing motion was slow and consistent, following a rhythm that builders repeated countless times over the day. Once the first course was finished, the second course began. These stones were slightly smaller, allowing builders to create a staggered pattern that increased stability. Each stone overlapped the joints below it, distributing weight evenly. The builders continued checking alignment constantly. They leaned over the wall, holding plumb lines against its face and watching the weights swing gently until they settled in perfect stillness. If the line fell straight, the wall was rising true. If it shifted even slightly, adjustments were made immediately. The sun climbed as the walls rose. Morning light cast uniform brightness across the stones, revealing their subtle textures and colors. Builders used this light to examine each stone's placement, ensuring that no shadow suggested misalignment. They paused occasionally to drink water, wipe dust from their hands, or rest shoulders stiffened from lifting. But even in rest, they remained attuned to the structure around them. They watched shadows shift, gauged how quickly mortar was drying, and observed wind patterns that might affect their scaffolding. Speaking of scaffolding, as soon as the walls reached about knee height, the builders began preparing the first platform. Even though the tower was still low, scaffolding allowed them to work more comfortably and safely. Carpenters built this initial platform from long beams supported by diagonal braces. The platform was set securely against the tower's exterior, but designed to be moved higher as the walls rose. Builders tested every plank before stepping on it, pressing gently with their feet, listening to the wood's response. Only when everything felt solid did they continue. Working from this raised platform, the builders began the next course. Each new layer increased the tower's presence, but to the builders, the height felt less important than the quiet precision of their movements. Their focus was on the stone at hand, the mortar beneath it, and the alignment above and below. Their eyes tracked vertical lines, their fingers traced joints. Their minds synchronized with the structure's quiet ascent as walls gradually reached waist height. The interior of the tower became easier to imagine. Builders could now look down into the enclosed space, seeing not just a foundation but the beginning of a room. They marked where stairs or ladders would eventually connect levels, where doorways would be carved, and where interior supports would stand. Though the tower was far from complete, its shape had begun to live in the builders' minds as something more than a simple arrangement of stones. It had purpose, direction, and an emerging presence. Builders continued laying stones throughout the midday hours, maintaining the same steady pace. They rotated tasks to conserve their strength, lifting, mixing mortar, shaping edges, checking alignment, and transporting stones. No single builder carried the same burden all day. This rotation kept their bodies balanced and their work consistent. Sometimes townspeople stopped to observe. Children pointed in curiosity, adults commented quietly on the rising stones, and travelers paused at the edge of the site to imagine what the tower might look like when finished. But even when watched, the builders did not change their pace. They were accustomed to being both seen and unseen. Their minds stayed focused on their work, unbothered by attention. Throughout the afternoon, the first few feet of wall slowly completed their rise. Builders stepped back regularly, viewing their progress from multiple angles. They crouched to check alignment at the base and stood on the scaffolding to check from above. They walked around the perimeter, ensuring that every face of the tower matched the others. These inspections were frequent and thorough. A tower that would stand for centuries needed this level of care. By late afternoon, when the sun began dipping lower, the mortar on the morning stones had started to firm. Builders could feel it beneath their hands, no longer soft, not yet fully hard, but holding shape. This was the moment when the wall began to feel like a real structure, capable of supporting its own weight. As the day drew to a close, the builders cleaned tools, covered mortar tubs to prevent drying, and brushed dust from their clothing. They examined the stones one last time, making minor adjustments where needed. They walked the perimeter slowly, taking in the early shape of the tower, the first signs of height emerging from what had been a flat surface only days before. The tower's progress was modest, but steady. The walls were only a few feet tall, but to the builders, they represented the beginning of something far greater. They left the site in the evening with quiet satisfaction, knowing that every stone had been placed with care, every measurement checked, and every effort aligned with the long, patient work ahead. The next morning, they would return. They would climb the scaffolding again, spread fresh mortar, lift new stones, check new alignments, and continue raising the tower one quiet layer at a time. As the tower reached a height taller than a person, the builders found themselves entering a new phase of work, the part where the structure no longer stayed comfortably at ground level. This was the moment when the tower began to assert its shape vertically, and the builders had to adapt their routine to keep climbing safely, steadily, and with the same quiet precision that defined the first stones. The way they built scaffolding, arranged platforms, and worked with ropes became just as important as the placement of the stones themselves. Scaffolding was both a tool and a companion. It grew alongside the tower, never rushing ahead or falling behind. Early in the morning, before heavy lifting began, builders walked along the existing scaffolding to inspect every plank and beam. They checked joints, tightened ropes that held braces together, and tested weight-bearing points. The wooden beams creaked gently under pressure, but these creaks were familiar, almost comforting. They told builders where the wood flexed, where it remained strong, and where adjustments might be needed. Scaffolding was built entirely of timber, long beams brought from nearby forests, shaped by carpenters who understood exactly how it responded to weight and weather. Each level of scaffolding consisted of horizontal planks laid across sturdy beams, supported by angled braces that anchored into the ground or into the tower's rising walls. Builders placed planks side by side, leaving just enough space between them for drainage during rain, but not enough for a foot to slip through. Everything was deliberate. Nothing was left to chance. The builder's relationship with scaffolding was built on trust and familiarity. When stepping onto a new platform, they paused for the slightest moment, allowing their weight to settle, listening to the response of the wood beneath them. They moved in groups of 2 or 3, spacing themselves evenly so no one section bore too much weight. Their steps were soft and measured, creating a natural rhythm that made the scaffolding feel almost like a second ground. Ropes played an equally important role. They hung from wooden frames, looped over pulley wheels, and tied around heavy stones. Builders inspected these ropes every morning. They ran their hands along the fibers, feeling for fraying or dryness that might compromise strength. Ropes were made of hemp, twisted tightly into long, sturdy strands that could support the weight of heavy blocks. Builders treated them with natural oils to keep the fibers flexible and strong. These ropes were simple, but their reliability made them indispensable. Working with ropes required teamwork. When a stone needed lifting, builders positioned it on a wooden cradle, a small frame designed to hold the stone securely. They tied ropes around the cradle using practiced knots, each knot made with intention. These knots were not decorative. They held weight that could not afford to slip. Once the ropes were secured, builders took their places at the pulley frame. Some pushed down on wooden handles to turn the wheels, while others guided the rising stone from below. Their movements were slow and predictable, synchronized through years of working together. As the stone rose, the builders below watched carefully, ready to guide it away from the wall if it swung too close. Even the smallest movement mattered. A gentle nudge, a quiet call of direction, and the stone shifted into place with a grace that belied its weight. The builders maneuvered it onto the scaffolding platform, then untied the ropes and rolled the stone into position with wooden levers. Platforms were extensions of the scaffolding. They were built level with the stones being placed, allowing builders to work comfortably without stretching or bending dangerously. Each time the tower rose a few feet, carpenters added new levels of platforms, the scaffolding growing with the tower in a layered, predictable ascent. The platforms became temporary floors, supporting workers, tools, mortar tubs, and stacks of stones waiting to be placed. These platforms created a unique working environment. Though suspended above the ground, they felt steady, almost home-like, to the builders. They rested tools neatly along the edges, kept mortar tubs near the center, and arranged stones in rows that followed their work pattern. Even at height, the site remained organized. The builders trusted their spacing and organization to ensure safety and efficiency. As the tower rose past 2, then 3, then 4 levels of scaffolding, the builders adjusted their routines accordingly. They climbed wooden ladders carved from thick beams, their hands gripping the smooth sides worn down by previous days. These ladders connected each level of the scaffolding, forming a quiet vertical path the builders followed repeatedly. Climbing became second nature. They ascended and descended so often throughout the day that they learned the feel of each rung underfoot. But no matter how high they climbed, the builders kept the same level of calm attention. They moved slowly, carrying tools carefully, avoiding sudden motions that might cause items to shift or fall. Their steps remained soft even at great height. The scaffolding responded with the faint creak of well-used wood, a sound that blended seamlessly into the background of construction. From high on the scaffolding, the builders saw the town from a new perspective. Roofs formed patterns they had never noticed from the ground. Streets curved gently around markets, courtyards, and workshops. Smoke rose slowly from hearths. Fields stretched beyond the town walls, their colors shifting with the seasons. Though the builders rarely paused to admire these views, the town's quiet beauty surrounded them nevertheless. Working at height gave them a sense of the tower's purpose. It was not just a structure. It was a meeting place between earth and sky, a point from which the world unfolded differently. On the platforms, the builders continued their work with stones. They lifted, placed, measured, adjusted, and smoothed. Mortar was mixed on upper levels as well, carried in buckets tied to ropes and hoisted upward. Builders used wooden paddles to spread mortar between stones, pressing it gently into every joint. They brushed excess mortar away, keeping the wall's surface clean. Their hands learned the texture of each stone, rough in some places, smoother in others, and how firmly to press without disturbing the layer beneath. While they worked, carpenters reinforced the scaffolding from below, tightening braces or adding new supports. The structure of wood and rope that surrounded the tower was nearly as impressive as the tower itself, though temporary and destined to be removed. Carpenters knew that every additional level needed to be as strong as the one before, if not stronger. They climbed the outside of the scaffolding, testing joints, replacing beams, and adjusting ropes. They did so quietly, blending into the rhythm of the builders above. The higher the tower rose, the more the builders used their tools in harmony. The plumb line became even more important. Builders held it against the rising stone face, watching the heavy weight at the bottom settle into stillness. If the line hung perfectly straight, the wall remained true. If it shifted even slightly, the builders corrected it immediately. They scraped mortar away, tapped stones gently with wooden mallets, and made small adjustments until every stone followed the intended vertical path. The straight edge helped maintain horizontal alignment. Builders placed it across stones to ensure edges matched and surfaces remained level. Even a small tilt could create problems at greater height, so they checked constantly. This calm repetition of checking became its own kind of ritual, a quiet assurance that the tower would rise as strong as intended. As the tower reached higher levels, the builders began to feel the impact of the wind. Up high, breezes felt stronger and more persistent. They brushed against clothing, carrying dust upward and cooling sweaty skin. Builders compensated by working slightly closer to the wall and keeping tools tied to the scaffolding to prevent them from slipping. They adjusted their footing against the breeze, making movements steady and deliberate. Work slowed slightly on windy days, but it never stopped. Communication became more important as height increased. Builders called instructions in soft but clear voices, ensuring stones were lifted safely and placed accurately. The calls echoed through the wooden frames, not loud or urgent, but precise. As ropes lifted stones, the builders above guided them carefully, using just their hands to keep the stones from turning or swinging. They did this not with force, but with small, controlled nudges, trusting the coordination between team members. Throughout the workday, the builders moved between levels of scaffolding with practiced confidence. They climbed ladders, passed tools, adjusted ropes, and checked alignments. They rested when needed, sitting on planks and drinking water from flasks tied to their belts. Rest periods were quiet, filled with soft murmurs about the day's progress or comments on the weather. When they felt ready, they stood again, lifted tools, and returned to the deliberate, even pace of construction. The tower grew slowly but steadily. Each layer took time to shape, align, and secure. Mortar needed hours to set properly before weight could be added above. The builders respected this timing completely. They never rushed the drying of mortar or the settling of stones. The tower's strength depended on patience. By late afternoon, when sunlight turned warm and shadows lengthened, the builders usually completed a full cycle of stone placement. They cleaned their platforms, brushed mortar from the planks, and covered tools. They tied ropes neatly, secured pulleys, and swept dust toward the edges. They walked the length of the scaffolding, checking the entire structure before descending. Their final steps of the day were always cautious, deliberate, and calm. Once they reached the ground, the tower stood above them, taller than it had been in the morning. Though not yet towering over the town, it had begun to take on a presence, a quiet shape against the sky. The scaffolding wrapped around it like a cradle, holding the tower as it grew, supporting both workers and stone. The builders left the site as the evening settled, their footprints soft in the dust at the base of the tower. Tomorrow they would return, climb again, lift again, measure again, and raise the walls a little higher. Each day would bring new stones, new adjustments, new layers, and the tower, patient and steady, would rise quietly under their hands. For builders shaping one of the tallest towers of their age, each day unfolded not as a race toward height, but as a carefully measured rhythm, a balance of physical strength, practiced skill, and quiet routine. Unlike travelers who passed through the town and marveled at the tower's rising height, the builders understood that progress was not simply upward. It was steady, intentional, and guided by a slow, patient rhythm that defined every hour from dawn to dusk. Their workday became a pattern repeated countless times, a sequence of movements shaped by years of experience and the gentle cooperation between people, tools, and the structure itself. The morning began in the calm light before sunrise. Builders gathered near the site while the air was still cool, their breath faint in the dimness. They arrived gradually, walking the familiar roads that led from their homes to the tower's shadow. Some carried small bundles of tools. Others simply brought themselves, knowing that their tools waited for them neatly arranged from the day before. The first minutes of the day were quiet. Builders exchanged soft greetings, discussed the weather, and stretched their hands and shoulders, preparing their bodies for the long hours ahead. Before any lifting or stonework began, the builders followed a familiar routine, inspecting the site. They walked the perimeter of the tower, examining the walls that had risen so far. Their eyes, trained to notice even the smallest shift in alignment or settling of mortar, scanned each layer with quiet concentration. They checked the condition of the scaffolding, touching each plank with their hands to feel for looseness. They tested the stability of ladders and the tightness of ropes tied around beams. This inspection was not rushed. It set the tone for the entire day, a reminder that caution and consistency mattered as much as the stones themselves. Once satisfied, the builders gathered their tools. Chisels, mallets, wooden paddles, stone hammers, measuring rods, and plumb lines. Everything needed its place. They arranged tools on each level of the scaffolding so they would not have to climb up and down unnecessarily. Mortar tubs were filled with fresh mixtures carried in buckets from the ground. Water barrels were refilled. Stones were rolled gently into place on platforms, ready for lifting. All of this preparation happened smoothly, almost silently. Each builder knew his task. Each motion followed naturally from the one before. When the sun finally rose, the day's true work began. The builders moved to their positions on different levels of the scaffolding. Some worked near the ground, shaping stones or preparing mortar. Others climbed higher to place new stones along the rising walls. The rhythm of the workday took shape. The soft scrape of chisels against stone, the gentle thud of wooden mallets, the quiet rasp of rope passing over wheel pulleys. These sounds filled the air in a steady pattern, never frantic, never loud enough to disrupt the calm focus of the workers. Strength played a role, of course. Some stones weighed enough to require multiple men carrying them on sturdy wooden stretchers. The builders learned early in their training how to balance weight between their shoulders and arms, how to walk in unison, and how to set a stone down gently without disturbing the mortar beneath it. But the work was never only about strength. It was also about coordination, placing a stone at the correct angle, applying exactly the right pressure, adjusting it by fractions until the plumb line fell perfectly straight. Skill developed through years of practice. Builders recognized the subtle shifts in sound that indicated whether a stone was properly fitted. They sensed when mortar was at the right consistency by how it spread across a surface. They could tell whether scaffolding beams would hold weight by feeling the slight give beneath their feet. These instincts were not taught through manuals or diagrams. They emerged slowly, accumulated over hundreds of workdays, becoming as much a part of the builders as the tools they carried. The rhythm of the workday also included moments of rest, not long breaks or pauses that halted progress, but short, quiet intervals woven naturally into the flow of tasks. Builders rested when mortar needed time to set, when ropes were being repositioned for the next lift, or when stones were being brought from the ground to the scaffolding. During these moments, they leaned against beams, wiped dust from their hands, or drank water from flasks. They spoke quietly about family, weather, or past projects. Rest was not separate from work, it supported it, allowing builders to maintain focus without exhaustion. Food was simple and eaten at midday. Builders descended from the scaffolding in small groups, sitting on shaded stones or wooden beams. They unwrapped bread, cheese, or fruit from cloth bundles. The meal was modest, but it restored their strength. After eating, the builders walked around the tower briefly, observing progress from ground level. Seeing the walls rise with their own eyes, something difficult to appreciate while standing on the scaffolding, gave them a quiet, satisfying sense of accomplishment. As the afternoon light softened, the work continued with renewed calm. The builders returned to their positions, spreading mortar, lifting stones, and checking alignments. They moved more deliberately in the afternoon, when heat or fatigue might set in. Their steps remained steady and measured. They took care not to rush, knowing that precision mattered more in the later hours of the day, when the hands naturally grew tired. The rhythm of lifting stones remained constant throughout the day. Builders on the ground tied ropes to the wooden cradles that held stones. Those on the higher platforms guided the stones as they rose, using their hands to steady the load. When the stone reached the correct level, workers slid it into place, nudging it gently with wooden levers. Mortar was spread beneath and between stones with smooth, slow movements of wooden paddles. Each layer of stone became part of the tower's growing body. Throughout the afternoon, shadows lengthened across the worksite. Builders noticed how the angle of sunlight changed the appearance of the walls. In the morning, sunlight revealed every detail clearly, making imperfections easier to spot. In the afternoon, shadows softened the stone's surfaces, requiring builders to rely more on touch and experience. They adapted easily, trusting their hands as much as their eyes. As the end of the workday approached, builders began the slow process of cleaning up. They brushed mortar from planks, wiped tools clean with cloths, and covered mortar tubs to keep the remaining mixture moist for the next morning. They tied ropes neatly and secured pulleys so that overnight winds would not disturb them. Carpenters checked the scaffolding once more, tightening any braces that seemed slightly loose. Builders descended the ladders carefully, taking their time to avoid accidents late in the day. Before leaving, they walked around the tower once more. The day's progress could be seen clearly now. A few new rows of stones, slightly higher walls, perhaps the beginnings of a new corner or arch. The builders observed this quietly, sharing soft comments about tomorrow's tasks or adjustments needed in the morning. Their satisfaction was calm, not celebratory. They understood that every day was just one part of a much longer journey. By the time they left the site, the tower stood silently against the early evening sky. It was taller than it had been that morning, but its rise felt slow and natural, shaped by countless small efforts rather than dramatic leaps. Builders walked home with dust on their clothes and tired but steady steps. They knew that tomorrow they would return to the same rhythm, climbing the scaffolding, lifting stones, spreading mortar, and repeating each action with the same patience and care. The rhythm of their workday was not something imposed by clocks or deadlines. It evolved naturally from the needs of the materials, the movements of their bodies, and the nature of building something meant to last for centuries. Strength, skill, rest, and routine blended into one continuous flow that carried the tower upward day after day. And as the builders rested at home in the quiet hours of night, the tower held their day's work firmly in place, waiting patiently for their return at dawn. As the tower continued to rise above the town, the stones used in construction also began to change. The early layers of the tower required broad foundation blocks and medium-sized stones that could be carried by teams of builders working in unison. But as the walls climbed higher and architectural features took shape, arches, corner reinforcements, and thick load-bearing sections. The builders needed to lift heavier stones than anything they had handled at ground level. These stones were too large for men to carry with stretchers alone. They demanded a different approach, a combination of simple machines, careful timing, and the steady coordination that came only from experience. The builders' lifting methods were surprisingly gentle. There was no sudden pulling, no loud shouting, and no rushing. Instead, the process unfolded with the same quiet patience that shaped the entire tower. Early each morning, before the heavy lifting began, the builders gathered around the wooden frames and lifting mechanisms that would hoist the larger stones. These machines, carefully built from timber, were deceptively simple in appearance. Wooden booms for leverage, pulley wheels carved from thick wood, strong hemp ropes, and weighted counterbalances. Yet in the builders' hands, they became precise tools capable of lifting tremendous loads. Before any lifting took place, the builders inspected every component. They ran their fingers along the ropes, feeling for worn fibers or rough spots that might catch during the lift. They checked the pulley wheels, turning them slowly to ensure they rotated smoothly. They tapped the beams lightly with their knuckles, listening for the deep, resonant sound that indicated solid, uncracked wood. If any sound suggested weakness or dryness, the beam was replaced or reinforced. The builders trusted their senses more than anything written. The sound, feel, and behavior of wood and rope guided their decisions. After the machines were inspected, the builders prepared the stones themselves. These large blocks were often carved on the ground the day before, shaped carefully so each side aligned perfectly with the surrounding stones. The largest blocks required extra attention. Builders marked lifting points on their surfaces, choosing areas where ropes or wooden frames could grip the stone without damaging its edges. They created wooden cradles, small frames fitted around each block, so that the weight of the stone would be distributed evenly during the lift. Once the stone was secured in its cradle, builders tied multiple ropes around it using knots they had practiced hundreds of times. These were not decorative knots. They were reliable, functional, and capable of holding extreme weight without slipping. The builders tightened each rope slowly, pulling in unison until the cradle fit snugly against the stone. They inspected the knots again, testing them with calm tugs before giving approval. The lifting process began quietly. Builders positioned themselves around the wooden frame, gripping long wooden handles attached to the pulley system. Others stood near the stone itself, ready to guide it gently as it rose. The moment the builders began turning the handles, the pulley wheels groaned softly, the ropes tightened, and the stone lifted fraction by fraction. It rose slowly, never more than a finger's width at a time, until it hovered just above the ground. At this stage, the builders paused. They crouched beside the rising stone and checked its alignment, ensuring it hung evenly and did not tilt or twist. If the stone leaned, they adjusted the ropes until it balanced perfectly. Only then did they resume lifting, turning the wooden handles together at the same steady pace. The stone ascended inch by inch, guided by the creaking of wood and the rustling of rope. Builders working on the scaffolding above stood ready. When they saw the stone rising into view, they moved closer to the edge of the platform, leaning slightly forward as they watched its slow ascent. They extended their hands carefully, not to push or pull forcefully, but to steady the load with small, precise motions. Even the slightest sway could disrupt the placement, so they used their palms to guide the stone as though they were calming an animal, gentle, consistent, and without tension. The stone reached platform level after several minutes. Builders above secured it temporarily with wooden wedges, preventing it from swinging. Then the lifting ropes were loosened gradually, lowering the stone onto the platform with controlled motion. Once the stone rested securely, the builders detached the ropes and the wooden cradle, carrying it aside for later use. Now the stone could be moved slowly across the platform using wooden rollers or levers. The builders nudged it carefully, rolling it a few handbreadths at a time until it sat exactly where it needed to be. The placement of the stone became the next careful ritual. Builders applied a fresh layer of mortar beneath the block, smoothing it evenly with wooden paddles. They then slid the stone into its final position, using short coordinated pushes that shifted the block in small, controlled increments. As with earlier stones, alignment was checked repeatedly. The plumb line swung gently, its weight settling as the tower's wall rose true. The builders adjusted the stone until all measurements matched. Only then did they press it firmly into place with their hands. This entire lifting process repeated countless times throughout the day. Each heavy stone required the same calm pace, the same attention, the same teamwork. Builders never lifted large stones during windy moments. They always waited for the breeze to settle. They avoided lifting when shadows were too long or when bright sunlight made it difficult to see clearly. Even the position of the sun influenced their timing. Morning and late afternoon were ideal for lifting, when heat was mild and light fell softly on the scaffolding. Communication during lifting was minimal but precise. Builders used short phrases, steady, higher, hold, shift, to coordinate movements. These words were spoken softly, not shouted. Everyone listened closely, attuned to the quiet voices that guided their motions. The simplicity of their communication ensured safety. No misunderstandings, no hurried commands, only calm direction shaped by experience. Between lifts, builders took brief rests. They leaned against beams, drank water, or sat on the scaffolding with their legs dangling over the side. These short breaks blended naturally into the rhythm of the day. They gave builders time to recover their strength and observe the tower's progress. From their resting places, they could see how far the tower had risen, how the walls formed their shape, and how new levels slowly emerged from the one below. As the walls rose higher, the lifting mechanisms had to rise as well. Carpenters adjusted the wooden frames, rebuilding them at greater heights. They climbed the scaffolding, carrying beams and ropes with them, assembling new lifting points with the same care they had used on the lower levels. These frames became the backbone of the tower's upper levels, allowing stones to be hoisted far above ground with surprising smoothness. The higher the lifting mechanism grew, the more wind the builders felt. They compensated for this by bracing their bodies against beams while working. They tied loose clothing more securely and placed extra wedges along the edges of platforms to prevent tools from shifting. The builders adapted seamlessly, always choosing caution over speed. As afternoon progressed and shadows lengthened, the builders completed their final lifts of the day. They chose stones carefully, selecting ones that could be placed before the mortar set completely. They never lifted a stone so late that it risked being placed in dim light. Visibility mattered, precision mattered, and so they ended the lifting portion of the workday with enough time to secure everything properly. When the final stone of the day was placed, the builders stepped back and observed their progress. The tower stood taller than it had that morning, its new stones glowing faintly in the warm evening light. Ropes swayed gently in the soft breeze. The wooden frames cast long shadows on the ground. The builders took in the quiet harmony of the scene, the subtle creak of wood, the scent of fresh mortar, the stillness of the rising tower. Before descending, they cleaned their tools, coiled the ropes neatly, and tied the pulley systems so they would not sway too widely overnight. They checked the scaffolding once more, ensuring every plank rested securely. They brushed dust from the stones, leaving the day's work clean and ready for tomorrow. When the builders finally walked away from the site, the tower stood quietly behind them, embodying the patient labor of countless coordinated motions. It was no longer just stone and wood. It had become the shared rhythm of many days, lifting, guiding, setting, and adjusting. A rhythm that would continue the next morning and the next, rising slowly toward the sky. As the tower gradually rose above the rooftops of the town, the builders found themselves facing not only the weight of stone and the height of scaffolding, but also the constant presence of the sky. In many ways, weather shaped their work as much as tools and materials did. The builders knew how to prepare a foundation, lift heavy stones, and measure each angle with precision. But they also understood the subtler tasks, reading the movement of clouds, listening to the wind through the beams, watching the shifting colors of dawn. Weather, seasons, and light became quiet partners in construction, guiding decisions throughout the day. Each morning, the builders arrived at the worksite before the sun fully rose. At that early hour, the world carried a soft stillness, and the sky held faint hues that predicted the day ahead. Builders learned to interpret these signs instinctively. A pale, steady glow along the horizon promised a dry morning. Wisps of high clouds indicated mild breezes. Deep, thick clouds hinted at slow-moving rain later in the day. The builders did not treat these observations as superstition. They were practical assessments that determined how quickly mortar would set, how easily ropes would turn, and how safely they could work on high planks. The sun itself played a central role in shaping the daily rhythm. During the early hours, its light was gentle, illuminating the stones without casting harsh shadows. Builders preferred to do delicate shaping and measurement work at this time. The soft morning light revealed imperfections clearly. Every stone surface, every joint, every line drawn with chalk appeared crisp under the pale glow. As a result, mornings often became the most productive hours for tasks requiring precision. As the sun climbed higher, its warmth deepened. On clear days, the heat made mortar dry faster. Builders compensated by mixing smaller batches and applying mortar in thinner layers so it would not harden before the stone could be placed. If the heat intensified, they shaded mortar tubs with cloth to slow evaporation. Working in direct sunlight also meant taking short breaks more frequently, not to rest fully, but to cool their hands, wipe sweat from their foreheads, and let their breathing steady. Afternoons brought deeper golden light, which softened edges and made details harder to see. Builders shifted their tasks accordingly. Instead of precision shaping or aligning delicate arches, they focused on broader work, adjusting scaffolding, preparing materials for the next day, or lifting stones that had already been shaped in the morning. They adapted naturally, trusting the flow of the day to guide them toward tasks best suited to the light. The builders' awareness of the sky extended beyond sunlight. Wind, in particular, shaped their work more than many people realized. Gentle breezes helped cool workers on warm days and dried mortar at a comfortable pace. But stronger winds required careful adjustments. High on the scaffolding, even small gusts could cause ropes to sway, making lifts less predictable. Builders learned to wait for the right moment before raising a stone. They often stood with one hand resting on a beam, feeling the strength of the wind travel through the wood. When gusts arrived, they paused. When the air stilled, they lifted. Wind also changed how builders spoke to one another. On calm days, soft conversations carried easily, but on breezy days, voices drifted quickly. Builders compensated by using hand signals, small, practiced motions that required no words. A raised hand meant hold. A circular motion meant continue lifting. A pointed finger showed the direction in which a stone needed to move. These gestures helped the builders maintain coordination even when the wind brushed their words into the open air. Rain affected the tower in quieter, more subtle ways. Builders never worked with mortar in active rainfall, as the moisture diluted the mixture and weakened the joints. But they did occasionally work during light drizzles or immediately after a rain shower, provided the scaffold planks were dry enough to walk safely. The sound of rain tapping against beams or dripping from higher stones added a gentle rhythm to the day, though the builders always remained cautious. Wet wood, slick stone, and softened earth demanded slower movements. When rain threatened, the builders covered the walls with simple protections: planks leaning against the rising structure, cloth draped over fresh mortar, or temporary roofing structures constructed from beams. These coverings did not keep the tower dry entirely, but they shielded the most vulnerable parts, allowing construction to continue without compromising stability. After heavy rains, the builders inspected everything: the mortar, the scaffolding joints, the state of the planks, and the ropes. Water softened wood over time, so these inspections played an important role in maintaining safety. Autumn brought a different mood entirely. Leaves along the nearby hills turned shades of gold and brown, drifting gently onto the roads leading to the construction site. The air cooled in the mornings, and the builders arrived with thicker garments, their breaths more visible in the crisp air. The light grew softer, arriving later and fading earlier. Builders adapted by adjusting their work hours slightly, beginning tasks that required high visibility early in the day and shifting to slower, repetitive tasks later. The breezes of autumn felt different from summer winds. They carried the faint scent of fallen leaves and moved steadily rather than suddenly. Builders used these steady breezes to dry mortar at a comfortable rate, though the colder temperatures meant mortar sometimes needed longer to firm. The builders compensated by adding slightly thicker layers of sand or adjusting the water content. Experience allowed them to judge the mixture by feel alone: how it clung to the paddle, how it settled into corners, how it responded to the pressure of the stone. Winter, however, required the most adaptation. The tower did not stop rising during winter months, but the work slowed noticeably. Builders arrived wrapped in many layers, their footsteps crunching softly over frost. Before climbing the scaffolding, they often warmed their hands over small braziers placed at the base of the tower. Cold fingers handled tools less reliably, so builders warmed their hands frequently, rubbing them together or holding them under their arms. Mortar preparation changed dramatically in winter. The builders mixed mortar in sheltered areas where small fires warmed the air, preventing the mixture from freezing. They carried buckets of warm water up the scaffolding, pouring it carefully into mortar tubs to maintain the right temperature. When applying mortar to the stones, they worked more quickly, ensuring it did not cool too fast. They also avoided placing stones late in the afternoon, when temperatures dropped quickly. On cold days, the stones themselves felt different. Their surfaces were colder to the touch, and builders wore thin gloves to protect their skin from the chill. They worked slowly and deliberately, avoiding fast movements that could cause slips on frost-dusted scaffolding planks. Carpenters inspected the scaffolding more often in winter, tightening braces, replacing any wood that had absorbed too much moisture, and adding new supports as needed. But even in winter, the builders' routine continued. They climbed carefully, lifted deliberately, and kept the tower rising according to the calm momentum built over months. Spring transformed the site once again. As snow melted and the earth softened, the builders observed how the ground responded. They checked the base of the scaffolding for any shifting caused by thawing soil. If wooden beams had absorbed too much winter moisture, they replaced them with fresh timber. Spring breezes warmed the site gradually, carrying the scent of new grass and damp earth. Builders welcomed this season. Mortar set more predictably. Light lasted longer. Stones felt warmer in hand. The builders paid close attention to light in spring. Morning light shifted in tone as clouds moved quickly across the sky. On some days, patterns of sun and shadow danced across the tower, requiring the builders to adjust their positions constantly to maintain clear visibility. On others, the light remained gentle and even, ideal for marking new features on the stone. Throughout all seasons, the builders' relationship with the sky remained constant in one important way. They respected it. They never forced work through unsafe weather. They adjusted their tasks not out of fear, but out of the understanding that tall structures demanded patience and cooperation with nature. The tower could not be rushed. It had to rise at the pace allowed by the materials, the workers, and the sky above them. Sunset brought the final transformation each day. The lowering sun cast long shadows across the site, tinting stones in warm, golden hues. Builders often paused briefly to look at the tower during this time. Something about the changing light revealed the structure differently, softening its edges, emphasizing its height, or illuminating small details they had not noticed before. This quiet moment, though not part of their official routine, became a natural conclusion to the day. As darkness approached, builders descended the scaffolding calmly. They tied ropes securely, covered fresh mortar, cleaned tools, and checked beams. The sky overhead deepened into evening blues, and the tower stood in silhouette, its outline marked by the day's new stones. Builders walked home feeling the satisfaction not of speed, but of harmony, work carried out in cooperation with weather, light, and the quiet movements of the seasons. Through rain and heat, through wind and frost, through long summer afternoons and short winter days, the builders continued their patient labor. The tower rose steadily because they trusted the rhythm of the sky, allowing nature to guide their hands as much as their tools did. In this partnership between workers and weather, the tower gained not only height but resilience, standing as a testament to patience, adaptation, and the gentle dialogue between humanity and the world above. As the tower rose steadily above the town's rooftops, its exterior walls became a familiar sight to anyone passing through the market or walking along the roads. But what most townspeople never witnessed were the hidden transformations happening inside those walls. Quiet, deliberate changes that slowly turned an empty vertical shell into a usable interior, one filled with floors, chambers, arches, and supporting structures strong enough to last for generations. While the outside of the tower represented impressive height, the inside represented precise craftsmanship, patience, and a level of coordination unique to medieval builders. Every tower began as an open shaft, its walls enclosing empty air while the structure grew upward. Builders stood on scaffolding along the outer and inner faces. Their work focused primarily on the walls during the early stages. But once the tower climbed high enough, the interior needed structure, platforms, floors, supports, not only for practical use, but to allow builders to access future levels from inside as well. This internal development was its own world, separate from the exterior work, unfolding slowly and quietly. The first interior element constructed was often the lower floor. This floor needed to be strong enough to hold workers, tools, and materials during the tower's long rise. Builders began by selecting large wooden beams, straight, sturdy, and long enough to span the width of the tower. Carpenters shaped these beams with slow, careful strokes, smoothing their edges and ensuring each beam rested firmly in the sockets carved into the stone walls. The sound of chisels carving stone sockets echoed softly through the hollow interior. These sockets were carved with precision. The beams needed to fit tightly without wobble, supporting weight without shifting. Once the primary beams were placed, smaller beams were laid across them, forming a wooden grid that each board would sit upon. Carpenters then carefully placed wooden planks along this grid, arranging them edge to edge so that the surface was even. The planks were not nailed. Nails were rare for such large structures, but rather fitted so well that they held together under their own weight and the pressure of daily use. Builders walked across this new floor cautiously at first, listening for any unusual creaks or signs of imbalance. When the floor passed their quiet tests, work could continue upward. With the interior floor established, the tower gained a new rhythm. Builders entered the structure through lower doorways, climbing ladders placed against the new wooden floor. This interior climbing offered shelter from weather and allowed work to continue even when winds made exterior scaffolding less comfortable. Inside, the light came from small openings left in the walls, narrow slits intended later for ventilation or defense. These openings created long stripes of light across the interior, soft and diffused, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air. The next interior task was shaping arches, an essential element in medieval towers. Arches distributed weight efficiently, carrying pressure downward into the strong exterior walls. Builders began by carving the arch stones, called voussoirs. Each voussoir needed to be shaped with exceptional precision. They were arranged around a temporary wooden frame called a centering. This centering acted like a mold, holding the voussoirs in place until all stones were set and the keystone, the final stone at the top of the arch, could lock the structure together. In the quiet interior of the tower, the process of assembling an arch unfolded like a slow, deliberate puzzle. Carpenters built the wooden centering on the wooden floor, raising it until its curved top matched the intended height of the arch. The smooth curve offered a guide for the stone builders. One by one, they carried the voussoirs up ladders, placing them along the curve of the centering. Each stone rested gently on the wood until the keystone finally slid into place. Once the keystone settled with a soft, solid sound, builders stepped back to admire the arch, the moment when stone began to hold itself in shape. Removing the centering required patience. Builders loosened it gradually, a little at a time, watching for any settling or shifting in the arch. When the wooden frame finally lowered away, revealing a self-supporting stone structure, there was no applause, no announcement. Just calm satisfaction carried in a few quiet nods. The arch had taken shape exactly as intended. Arches supported not only doors and passageways, but also internal walkways, stairs, and additional floors. Each new level of the tower required a new interior framework. Carpenters repeated the process for the second and third floors much the same way. They carried beams through narrow openings in the walls, lifted them up using interior ropes, and positioned them with steady coordination. Every floor strengthened the structure, making it more stable as the height increased. Light remained a constant companion during this process. Builders learned how sunlight moved through the tower's small windows throughout the day. Morning light entered from the east, casting soft patterns across fresh planks and illuminating dust in slow swirls. Midday light fell harder and more direct, creating clear lines that helped builders examine stone surfaces. Late afternoon light softened again, painting the interior with warm tones that signaled the end of the workday. These cycles of light helped guide both timing and mood inside the tower. Staircases became another significant part of interior construction. Many medieval towers used spiral staircases carved into the thickness of the wall. These staircases spiraled upward in a slow, steady rotation, designed to take up minimal space while providing reliable access between levels. To create these stairs, builders cut deep steps into the stone wall itself. They often began at the second level, carving a central column that supported the steps or using the wall directly if it was thick enough. The slow scraping of chisels echoed through the tower as stone dust drifted into the air. Carpenters added wooden handrails or temporary supports, allowing builders to climb safely while working on upper floors. Spiral stairs required immense patience. Each step needed the correct depth, height, and angle. Builders tested each one immediately after carving it, stepping on it with full weight to ensure it did not crumble or tilt. Only when the entire sequence of steps was carved and tested could work shift upward. As the interior took shape, builders also constructed interior platforms and walkways that connected sections of the tower. These platforms helped move materials efficiently, reducing the distance stones needed to be lifted from the ground to higher floors. Workers standing inside the tower used these platforms to guide stones arriving from outside lifts, adjusting their positions carefully so that the interior and exterior work remained synchronized. This coordination between interior and exterior teams became more essential with each new level. Builders inside communicated with those outside using specific, quiet signals, light taps on the wall, soft knocks with wooden blocks, or gentle verbal cues that carried just enough sound through stone. These signals ensured stones were placed exactly where needed, whether for an interior arch, a corner reinforcement, or a wall junction. Water and mortar played a central role inside the tower as well. Workers carried buckets of water up ladders and passed them hand to hand. Mortar tubs were prepared on each floor, using mixtures adjusted to the interior temperature and humidity. Inside the tower, the air often felt cooler and more stable than outside, which meant mortar dried slightly slower. Builders used this to their advantage, allowing them a little more time to adjust stones before the mortar stiffened. Ventilation inside the tower was important during construction. Narrow window slits allowed air to move through the interior, carrying away dust and preventing the space from feeling too enclosed. Builders sometimes paused to stand near these openings, letting the breeze cool their faces while observing the town from above through the narrow view. These moments were brief yet comforting, offering a quiet pause in the day's labor. As the tower grew taller, its interior became a living structure. Floors took shape, arches strengthened the rooms, staircases spiraled upward, and small chambers formed naturally within the thick walls. Some of these chambers served as storage spaces during construction, holding spare tools, ropes, and wooden beams. Others would later be used for practical purposes, holding lamps, storing important documents, or providing quiet rooms for town officials. Throughout this internal development, the work never felt rushed. Builders understood that the interior would outlast them, carrying future footsteps, echoing future voices, and holding memories long after their own names were forgotten. Every decision carried weight, but this weight was not heavy. It was steady, grounding, and meaningful. As more floors were completed, builders began using the interior to travel upward. Instead of climbing exterior ladders, they entered the tower, climbed spiral staircases, crossed newly built wooden platforms, and emerged higher on the scaffolding. This interior route made the work safer and more efficient, especially on windy days when the exterior scaffolding swayed more noticeably. For the builders, it felt like the tower itself was beginning to help them rise, its interior becoming a path rather than an obstacle. Work continued this way for many months. Each new level brought a new interior. Each interior brought new tasks, and each task added quiet strength to the tower. The structure became not just a tall shell, but a functional space shaped carefully from within. The inside of the tower grew just as gracefully as the outside, though almost no one in the town saw this progress. By the time the tower reached its middle height, the interior had transformed from an empty enclosure into a network of floors, stairs, arches, and rooms, all crafted patiently, all aligned perfectly, all ready to hold weight, footsteps, and centuries of life. And as the builders completed each interior level, they stepped back into the evening light, satisfied not with speed or spectacle, but with the slow, quiet perfection of stone and timber arranged exactly as they intended. Thank you for spending this quiet time tracing the steady hands, patient rhythms, and everyday routines of the builders who slowly lifted Europe's tallest towers into the sky. These structures may look grand and imposing today, but behind each one stood workers who moved calmly through long mornings, who shaped every stone with care, and who trusted the slow progress of their craft far more than speed or spectacle. If tonight's peaceful journey helped you relax or drift closer to sleep, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you. Was it the scaffolding rising with the tower, the careful alignment of each stone, or the quiet teamwork high above the town? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy reading what resonated with you. And if you'd like more gentle stories from forgotten corners of history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and ensures you won't miss the next calm chapter. Rest well, and I'll see you soon in another quiet journey through the past.